Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Moderate Podcast for Saturday, May 8th, 2021. It's always great to have all of you aboard on the program. And we've had a couple of odd things happen. Again, the show continues to grow, and we appreciate that. And, it is encouraging to see more and more people listening to the show and us moving up the ranks. I'm tracking the show on Chartable and on other platforms that allow us to kind of get an idea of where our audience is. We continue to get responses to our survey, which is much appreciated. Some great feedback, and it kind of confirms some of the things I thought. For example, apparently our Survivor segment was not a very popular portion of our show, and the numbers reflect that out too. When we would have that, we have data that actually can show how many people stay tuned to the show, as far as when listenership drops off. If people don't listen to the entire program, and it really fell off when we did the Survivor segments, and that makes sense. I mean, you're here to listen to political commentary. And so when I branch off to that other thing, it really doesn't really follow what the show's about. So a lot of people are going to lose interest. So it actually makes a lot of sense. So I'm not offended by that at all. I completely understand. And so, I want to make sure that the show is, it is my show. And, that people acknowledge that. And I can do what I want. I'm a one-man operation. And but at the end of the day, I do want to keep the listeners engaged, because the more listeners are engaged, when we grow the audience, the more feedback I get, and I get to hear other ideas as well. That's also part of what this show is for me. It is a way to express my ideas, and in turn, I get to hear feedback from others, which is why I always want to hear feedback from the audience, and I want emails. You can email me at host@themoderatepodcast.com. Interaction on Twitter is very helpful, because I will post things. I haven't been as good about it the last couple of weeks because it's just been very crazy busy. But that is where I do most of my commentary during the week, whether I post an article or just make a general tweet about, certain things that are happening. So if you want to follow me at the Mod Podcast 1 on Twitter, that's where I have the most interaction. I don't do a lot on Facebook. I mainly just post links to every week to the show, and we get listeners, people that actually get the show that way. But that's typically what I use Facebook for. And so, so I guess I say all that to say that we had an odd thing in those rankings that I was talking about on Apple Podcasts. Our vaccine program a couple of weeks ago was the number one episode in the government category in the Philippines. I know that's really, really strange, but it's true. And I got that. And I'm like, what the hell? That blew me away. So, if you're listening in the Philippines, we appreciate you. We thank you. Maybe we'll try to throw a political story or two about the Philippines in here, and if it's relevant to American. I mean, my audience, my core audience and focus is in the United States, obviously, and I think people around the world, because we are kind of that global superpower, and people are very interested in, things, good and bad things that are happening here could have effects on other parts of the world, right? And the Philippines have always been a long ally of the United States. Used to be. There's been different territorial battles for the Philippines over history. And so, I thought that was just fascinating. So anyway, I digress. Now, of course, we talk about politics, but I do want to mention one story that's not really related to politics. It's related to sports, but it's something that has been covered quite a bit, and people that aren't even sports fans necessarily probably know about, and that's the Houston Astros. So as you may recall, the Houston Astros were embroiled in this controversy because of cheating, specifically related to the 2017 World Series. in their World Series championship, but not just the World Series, like that entire season. So there was, the banging of trash cans, and it just came out that, yes, they indeed were doing things that were against the rules. Sign stealing in and of itself is not against the rules. That has been an age-old thing. A player's, peering in for... That's why catchers change their signs when there's a runner on second, because that runner on second's looking in at what the signs are and trying to relay that to the batter. I mean, we did that when I played baseball in high school. That's one of the things we did. If we were able to figure out the pattern of the catcher's signs, we would absolutely relay that to our hitters. So, obviously when I pitched, I had to make sure that our signals were such that, that the player on second couldn't pick up on those, right? So you change up your signs, you have different patterns that you use. But you're not allowed to use electronics to steal signs. And that's what the Astros were doing. So anyway, everyone knows they were cheating. They got caught, and they basically admitted to, yes, we were doing that. So obviously that came out before the 2020 season. Then the pandemic hits. And so then no fans were in attendance to actually give them crap for it. So the 2021 season is finally the time that we get to actually heckle them for this. And they get to start paying some consequences, because the organization paid consequences, but the players involved didn't have any consequences whatsoever. My dad and I were just talking about this, because on one hand, you've got Pete Rose, who was banned for life from baseball because he was betting on his own team. Betting on his team to win, by the way. There's no evidence that he ever bet on them to lose, and that therefore he might have thrown ball games. He always bet on his team to win. So one could argue that the bets that he placed probably had no bearing on the outcome of the game, because he was managing to win, right? And you managed to win anyway, I would think. Now, I made the point to my dad, I'm like, well, you may have made personnel decisions based on that one game, versus sometimes you may pull a pitcher because you want to keep their pitch count down, or you're trying to watch that because you want to keep them healthy for the entire season, versus if you're trying to win that game because you have a bet on it, you may keep a pitcher in that you might have otherwise taken out because of your bet, versus looking at the long term. It's a 162 game season. Yeah, you want to try to win every game, but you have to have sometimes of a long strategy because the season is so long. So, if it affected personnel decisions, it could have affected players, health, those kind of things. And so, yeah, there should probably be some punishment for that. And the whole reason that baseball cracks down so much on gambling in particular, especially gambling on baseball, is because of what happened in 1919 with the Black Sox controversy. But in this case, you have a team that was actively cheating. They get caught, and really they get some fines. They get some suspensions from managers and front office people. But the players that were engaged in this, that knew what was going on and were actively participating in it, didn't have any consequences, right? So the only way we have now as fans is to give them crap for it, right? So they're getting rightfully heckled. Well, there was a story when they finally visited New York to play the Yankees, because they played them in the American League Championship Series in that particular season. They got I don't know if they played him in 2017 or 2018 now that I think about it. But anyway, they got the fans just filleted them. I mean, they just went after them. And, it's New York. That's what New York fans do. And so there was a rumor that started from a security guard that, hey, we've got to confiscate some stuff because the Astros complained. Well, this story went viral. And so the story is that the Astros complained to Major League Baseball about the heckling, right? That doesn't, and when I first heard that, I'm like, that doesn't make sense. I mean, how can the Astros really do that? Especially, like, they know, like, if you say that, you're not going to actually, you're not going to actually, like, that's going to just makes things worse for you. It's not going to fix it. It's going to make it worse, right? Because now on top of the cheating, now you look like a bunch of whiners, right? Well, lo and behold, turns out that the whole story is bogus. That didn't happen. No one at Major League Baseball said, oh yeah, that didn't, there's no evidence of that happening. Astros say, yeah, that didn't happen. And that made sense because on the surface, that story made no sense to me. And the only reason I bring it up is because it's just kind of a cool, funny little anecdote. But also, we did actually talk about the cheating scandal on the show in the past. So sometimes when I talk about stories, even from a long time ago, and things come up that are relevant to it, I'll mention them on the show. So that's one of them. Another one that I want to just mention really quickly. About a month ago, maybe a little bit more than that, I talked about Peleton and this issue, the safety issue with their treadmills, and that basically, the Consumer Public Safety Commission put out a warning about the Pelotons and safety related and around kids, that kids can get trapped under them. And Peloton actually stood up to them and said, no, we're not going to recall anything. You need to just use common sense. And I applauded them for this, right? I said that was the right thing to move to make. Well, it turns out that they felt they made a mistake. So here's the story. Peloton CEO John Foley said on Wednesday that the connected fitness company's voluntary decision to recall its Tread Plus and treadmills after one child's death and other reports of injuries was, quote, the right thing to do for the company's members and their families. And he said that it was a mistake, that he made a mistake, that when they had no intention of recalling the Tread Plus. Now, here's the thing. I have to believe that after those incidents happening, and that was their reaction, there were lawyers on the phone, and that their attorneys went to him and say, and the attorneys told him he made a mistake probably by doing this, because you have a recall, you have these documented injuries. If you do nothing about it, you're already probably going to face litigation for this, and you're going to face a class action. You're just making it worse for yourself if you do nothing about this. So do I believe that John Foley really feels, that these recalls are justified? I don't. I think he's doing it as a business decision, which, I mean, he probably, in hindsight, he probably should have done that in the first place. And but the decision is not being made for safety purposes. It's being made because his lawyers are telling him you need to do this. I'm speculating here. There's nothing in this article that says that, but that's what I have to believe is true, because the timing of this just doesn't make any sense. Why all of a sudden did they reverse themselves? I have to believe that there was probably sums of money that would probably put the company in dire straits. So they probably had no choice but to do this. Now, again, I still believe that any treadmill, when kids are around it, can cause serious injury. It's not just this one. Common sense is not common anymore, and we can just throw that out the window, right? Because the bottom line is that if anything can go wrong, even if just a shred of common sense were used, like, I don't know, lock the door when you're using this thing, or don't use it when your kids are around. Like, when your kids aren't even home. Like, use it when they're at school. All right. But if you have kids that are too young to go to school, they're not in preschool yet, whatever. Don't use it when they're just tooling around the house with the door open and just, or an open area. Don't use a treadmill when you have a little one like that around. It's just common sense. You would think that kids don't know any better. If you're sitting there sprinting on a freaking treadmill and your kid crawls up behind you, don't know it, and he gets flung against the wall, that can happen with any treadmill, not just these. Now, is there, they're trying, I guess, obviously, there is a design flaw in this particular one, but I have to imagine that there's injuries that happen too. Now, again, maybe the injury rate on this one's more, and that's why we're doing it. But I just think that there is this semblance of missing common sense and people not taking responsibility for themselves or their actions or their equipment and not having safety in mind. I don't know how maybe because they get trapped underneath. I mean, there are different factors, obviously. Maybe there's a design flaw from that standpoint, and that could very well be the case. But it's not like this couldn't have been prevented by just not having your kids around when you do this. Wait till the spouse gets home. Wait till, put your kid in daycare. Because here's the thing. If you can afford a $2,500 treadmill, you can probably afford to put your kids in daycare. These are not people that are living paycheck to paycheck, working 3 jobs, barely can put food on the table that are buying these products. Let's be clear about that. They start at $2,500. The Tread Plus is $4,295, $4,295, plus the monthly subscription that goes along with it. So don't tell me that these people that buy this thing can't afford to have their kids babysat, daycare, whatever. Okay? That's just not happening. I guarantee you. Because there's no way that if you're buying a $2,500 treadmill, but you can't afford to put your kid, just have a babysitter over while you're working out to keep an eye on the kid, or can't afford that. I mean, give me a break. So you need to change your priorities if that's the case. Again, common sense, people. But anyway, since I reported on that story, I wanted to bring it forward. All right. So I do want to report on a couple of. I had another story I was going to talk about, but I'm going to skip that one for now. So a couple of COVID stories, because we've been covering this lately. You'll recall that I talked about how the politics have kind of flipped on coronavirus a little bit. So when it first started, because Donald Trump was so inconsistent on his messaging with that, the right is who politicized the coronavirus at first, and the liberals were rightly following the science. Well, here's an article from The Atlantic, by no means a conservative publication, a very liberal publication, as a matter of fact, that even they are calling out their fellow liberals about being ridiculous now about this. All right. So if you think that I've just some kind of flip and I'm some kind of right-wing nut now when it comes to COVID, apparently The Atlantic is now a crazy right-wing publication as well, if you believe that. So let me start off by saying this. Lurking among the jubilant Americans venturing back to bars and planning their summer wedding travel is a different group. Liberals who aren't quite ready to let go of pandemic restrictions. For this subset, diligence against COVID-19 remains an expression of political identity, even when that means overestimating the disease's risks or setting limits far more strict than what public health guidelines permit. This spring, after the vaccine rollout started, a third of very liberal people were, quote, very concerned, end of quote, after becoming seriously about becoming seriously ill from COVID-19, compared to with a quarter of liberals and moderates, according to a study conducted by the University of North Carolina. And 43% of very liberal respondents believe that getting the coronavirus would have a very bad effect on their life, compared to a third of liberals and moderates. Now, for many progressives, extreme vigilance was in part about opposing Donald Trump. And you don't think that the media knew that? Come on. Some of this reaction was born of deeply felt frustration with how he handled the pandemic. It could also be knee-jerk. If he said keep schools open, then, well, we're going to do everything in our power to keep schools closed, said Monica Gandhi, a professor of medicine at University of San Francisco. Gandhi describes herself as left of left, but has alienated some of her ideological peers because she has advocated for policies such as reopening schools and establishing a clear timeline for the end of mask mandates. We went the other way, in an extreme way, against Trump's politicization of the virus, Gandhi said. The spring of 2021 is different from the spring of 2020, though. Scientists know a lot more about COVID-19 spreads and how it doesn't. Public health advice is shifting. But some progressives have not updated their behavior based on the new information. Remember, they're the follow the science crowd, right? And they continue to say that. When you try to contradict them, they always say, "Well, I follow the science." They're following the science from 6 months ago, a year ago, not today. They're not following the science from today. And in their eagerness to protect themselves and others, they may be underestimating other costs. Again, that's something that we've talked about, the unintended consequences of this. And sometimes you got to start to think at some point, maybe it is intended consequences. Maybe they're consciously thinking this because they have a worldview that they can use this as a weapon to implement their will. That's totally conspiracy theory sounding, but damn it, like the longer this goes, the more it seems like that could be the case. Being extra careful about COVID-19 is mostly harmless when it's limited to wiping down your groceries with Lysol wipes and wearing a mask in places where you're unlikely to spread the coronavirus, such as hiking on a hiking trail. But vigilance can have unintended consequences, like I said, when it imposes on other people's lives. Even as scientific knowledge of COVID-19 has increased, some progressives have continued to embrace policies and behaviors that aren't supported by evidence, such as banning access to playgrounds, closing beaches, and refusing to reopen schools for in-person learning. For those who are vaccinated on the left seem to think overcaution now is the way to go, which is making people on the right question the effectiveness of the vaccine. That's true. They're saying if the vaccine's so good, why? But you're continuing to act the way you did before the vaccine even was released, much less in the arms of many, many people, right? So if that's the case, what's the point of the vaccine then? And that's a good question. That doesn't make any sense. Public figures and policymakers who try to dictate others' behaviors without any scientific justification for doing so erode trust in public health and make people less willing to take useful precautions. The marginal gains of staying shut down might not justify the potential backlash. Very, very well stated. So this is from Emma Green. The article is from Emma Green in The Atlantic. So good for her. Liberals even calling out other liberals now. And so, it gives us hope that there are reasonable, rational people still out there. So that's good. Now, of course, the media wants to have a they were the ones that wanted to have victory on this. And when right-leaning places like Texas, like Florida, even Georgia, decided to start opening up more and are almost pretty much fully open now with very few, if any, restrictions. And yet seeing the numbers not increase like everyone panicked that they would, because remember what Joe Biden said, Neanderthal thinking. And it turns out that maybe, just maybe, what they did wasn't disastrous. That maybe what they're doing is working. So, of course, the media, especially the left-leaning media, is trying to glam on to a place where they can point to say, hey, no, we are justified in doing and thinking the way we were thinking, right? We're justified in that. Well, they may have something in San Francisco. Adam Bergeron is looking forward to reopening the Balboa Theater, the independent movie theater in San Francisco he owns and operates. San Francisco's been a model for doing COVID the right way, if there is such a thing, Bergeron said. San Francisco and its suburbs have been cautious, maintaining various restrictions while other parts of the country reopened for business and eased mask mandates. Meanwhile, its vaccination rate is among the highest of any major U.S. city, with 2/3 of all adults having received at least one dose. But again, these very liberal people that we just talked about in the previous article are the same ones that are being talked about in this article, okay? Because San Francisco is full of those type of people, right? Probably even more so than most other parts of the country. So with that being the case, yeah, they've got a lot more vaccinations, but they're still locked down. And eventually they probably will get to herd immunity because they will have a very high vaccination rate. As a matter of fact, here's part of that. So with 2/3, they're already at 2/3, and they're going to continue to increase. Over the past 7 days, San Francisco, home to more than 870,000 people, recorded an average of only 26 new COVID cases per day. 2/3 of all adults and almost 60% of the greater metro area of 4.7 million have been vaccinated with at least one dose, one of the highest rates in the U.S. Its positivity rate for tests sits at 1.2%. So when you calculate that into per 100,000 in terms of the number of cases, you're about a little over 3, about 3.2 per 100,000. When you combine that with a very low a positive test rate, what that means is that they're not getting a lower number of cases simply because they are testing less people. So when you look at somewhere like Dallas County, which has a similar population, maybe a little bit more than San Francisco, they have they're coming in at about 6 per 100,000, like I think between 5 and 6 the last time I checked per 100,000 on their 7-day average. But their positivity rate is around 5% statewide, and this is a statewide in Texas. So what that would indicate is they're not testing as many people possibly. So that could skew the number down a little bit. So that number, when you have to look at both. I could say, I only have 1 per 100,000 cases, right? Because I only tested one person, but my test positivity rate would be 100%, right? So that's where you could play with the numbers, you can manipulate the numbers, which is why you have to look at both of those figures to see how relevant one number is versus the other, right? Okay, so makes sense. So again, I think that San Francisco's numbers are better, but it's probably because they have a higher vaccination rate. It has nothing to do with the other measures we're taking, because a lot of times, even with the social distancing, with the limited capacities and things like that, we're still in enough situations where if we're going to catch it, we're going to catch it, right? And again, because there's been this emphasis on, oh my gosh, well, there's still, the way it's spread is through asymptomatic carriers. That would mean, again, that the number of cases that are actually out there versus what are known is significantly higher, maybe 4 or 5 times higher. So if we're at 30 million, 32 million cases, that means you're probably closer to like 120 million. So that would indicate that over a third of people in this country have already had it and have natural immunity to it. Now, of course, there's going to be crossover between the people that have had it and the people that are getting vaccinated. There's going to be people that are going to be in both groups. So you can't just add the two together and say we're good. But the bottom line is that we are at a point now where we know, because again, at the beginning of this thing, at this time last year, to me, the biggest concern is, does this have a death rate that's equivalent to the original SARS, which was significantly higher, that it turns out, than this one, or even worse, MERS, but, excuse me, can actually spread even faster than the flu? See, that's what you don't want to have. You don't want to have something that's as deadly as MERS, which had a 30% death rate, that can actually spread as quickly as this coronavirus did. That would be a disastrous situation, catastrophic, okay? And they weren't sure that was the case, because there are very deadly coronaviruses like MERS, or there are very benign, relatively benign coronaviruses, such as the common cold, right? So there are a variety of coronaviruses, and this was a new one. That's why it was called novel, because it was brand new. We had never seen it before. So nobody knew what it was going to do. Nobody knew how it was going to affect our health. And it was still going to take a long time. It's probably going to take years to really figure out why some people got sick from it and died from it, and why others completely, there are some already things that we know about that, like if you have comorbidities and things like that, there's some patterns we can see. But it's going to be really a long time before we really drill down into what specific things, what specific attributes made people more vulnerable and made them more sick from the coronavirus versus other people that got it and nothing happened to them whatsoever. And all those little, subtleties and things like that, all those patterns, it's going to take years to figure out exactly how that happened. But the bottom line is, it's certainly closer to a common cold as far as death rates than it is to the original SARS from 2003. Okay? And it does, and what's encouraging is you look at these different types of viruses, the faster that they spread, the easier that they can spread, the less deadly they are, the less potent they are, it seems like. Because they have to multiply a lot to be able to be spreadable. Whereas maybe they aren't, when it's more potent, more deadly, they don't have to develop as much within the host and it kills them more quickly and they don't spread. So they have to do one of two things. They have to feed on the host that they're in, or they have to rely on spreading. Well, if they rely on spreading, they can't kill the host. That's not how they survive. I mean, these viruses it makes it sound like they have a brain and they can actually process these things. But I think it's just a function of nature in terms of how viruses operate in general, not just coronaviruses, any viruses out there. So like HIV, for example, can basically kill your immunity system and actually can overpower it, right? And makes you immunocompromised. So that's why it's called HIV, right? Human immunovirus, right? So, but because of its potency to do that, it doesn't have to spread from a host to host like this coronavirus does to survive, because it can feed off of its host for years. It doesn't have to spread to another one. So that's why spreading it takes a lot more, I guess, for lack of a better term, it takes more effort, right? But it's more deadly because it's more deadly. So it seems like there is this reverse correlation between if it's more deadly, it's harder to spread. If it's less deadly, it's easier to spread, type of thing. So these variants that are coming out that spread more quickly, actually that might mean that they're less potent based on that theory. Now, I'm not a virologist or epidemiologist. I don't know any about these things. This is just a theory, just looking at different viruses and how they spread and then how deadly they are. It just seems like there is a pattern there. And maybe there is something to that. Maybe there's nothing to it at all. I don't know. That's just my theory. So anyway, so that's where San Francisco is. So basically they're looking at San Francisco as a model. Basically, bottom line is keep locked down until you get the virus, until you get the vaccine. That's what they did, right? But it seems as though that, you might have a little bit more risk by just opening everything up. But open everything up, but still get the vaccine. If you can just combine those two things, I think you'd be in great shape. So the places that are opening really quickly, they're not embracing the vaccine as much. If they could open up quickly and embrace the vaccine, I think that's the most ideal situation. But that's just me. So anyway, when we come back, as I promised last week, we didn't get to it last week, but so this week we're going to talk about the California recall and what that's about. It is a story related to California, but it's a pretty major story because these kind of things do not happen a lot. You don't see recalls of governors happening every day, so it's a pretty big news story. So we're going to cover that when we return. Brush is an electric toothbrush that will change the way you think about brushing your teeth. With powerful sonic technology and ultra-gentle bristles, the Brush redefines what it means to have super clean teeth. It's like that feeling when you just leave the dentist, a fresh, whole mouth clean every single day. Our listeners get 15% off their total purchase with code POD15. Follow the link in the show notes and enter the code POD15, POD15, to get your exclusive discount and upgrade your oral care routine. Welcome back to the Moderate Podcast, powered by Podbean. Yeah. It's been great being on Podbean. So I've really enjoyed it so far, and I think that's actually helped grow the audience as well as the change in hosts. Again, no knock on Anchor at all whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, but we were ready to take that next step, I think, in our podcast evolution. So, all right, let's talk about the governor of California and the recall that is happening. So, California Governor Gavin Newsom, his recall has officially qualified for the ballot. So first of all, we're going to do three things here. We're going to first of all talk about how the recall works, what recalls are in general, and what in California, but specifically in California, and how the process works. Then we're going to talk about the only other time in California history where a recall has taken place, and that was in 2003. And then we're going to talk about actually Gavin Newsom's recall and why he's being recalled and what the odds are of him actually being removed from office. And I think looking back at the 2003 case is going to be a good indicator of where this recall will likely go. So, first of all, California is one of 19 states that allows voters to remove state officials, and by the way, local officials, before the end of their term. Any elected official in California can be recalled. No reasons necessary. You don't have to have a reason for it. You can just be like, I don't like the ties he wears. I don't like the way he dresses. I don't like the color of his eyes. It can be for any reason. It can even be for a racist reason. I don't like because he's white, whatever. Or, I don't like him because he's black. It doesn't have to have a reason. The only requirement to put a recall on the ballot is enough voter signatures. And the number that you need is 12% of voters in the last election for the office. And it also must include voters in at least 5 counties. So, for example, Los Angeles County is the most populous county in California. It's got over 10 million people. So it represents 25% of the population. So you don't want to just have Los Angeles County, drive a recall. One county can recall the governor. So you don't want to have that. So you have to do the recall drive in at least 5 counties. So the magic number for Newsom, because it's based on the 2018 elections, so it's the last election for that office. So he was elected in 2018. Excuse me. So that number, that 12% of the voters would be 1,495,709 valid signatures. And again, you can only sign it once. Now, people do sign it more than once, and so we're going to go through how that process gets done. Election officials announced on April 26th that the recall campaign submitted 1,626,042 valid signatures, enough to qualify for the ballot. So state officials must now complete a few more steps to finalize the process, and then an election will be held later this year, probably will be sometime in the fall. It doesn't have to be on a regular election day. So in other words, the general election every year is the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Most states have they have basically standardized on that date. So that's even though that's what's constitutionally required for a presidential election, most states have actually just standardized on that date every year. They'll have other election dates throughout the year, but most states will have an election at least on that time. So that might be when it takes place. However, it doesn't have to. So as we talk about with Gray Davis and what happened with him in 2003, we'll note that it didn't take place on that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And then the recall has 2 questions on it. Do they want to recall Newsom? Yes or no? It's an up or down. You're not voting for Newsom. You're just voting for his recall. Do you want him recalled? You want him removed from office? You vote yes. If you don't want him removed, you vote no. And if more than 50% of voters say yes, who should replace him? So even if you vote no on the recall, you can still vote for somebody as a candidate if he gets yes. If you're in the minority, even though you vote no, you can still vote in the election to replace him. You don't have to vote yes just to replace him. You know what I'm saying? Like to vote for that person. So that's where things and where people run, and there's a lot of risks involved for the party that's in power of how they approach this, and we're going to talk about that later. So there's no limit on the number of candidates who can run to replace an official on a recall ballot. And whoever gets the most votes wins, regardless of if they have the majority or not. There's no runoffs. There's no nothing like that. It's the highest vote getter wins if the recall succeeds. So it's entirely possible for someone to be elected in a recall while winning less than half the votes. And as we'll find out in 2003, that is exactly what happened. But you could even have a situation where the recall, the yes-no on the recall was very, very close. And let's say you have like 100 people on the ballot, right? So you could have 51% yes, 49% no. So in other words, 49% of the people want to keep the governor that's there. So in this case, Gavin Newsom. But then the highest vote getter in the replacement election only gets, let's say, 40% of the vote. So you could argue that Gavin Newsom got more votes because there's a higher percentage of people, or a higher number of people even, that voted to keep him versus the person that is going to replace him. That is entirely possible in this situation. So that is what really makes this process kind of wonky. So California has a long-established procedure for making sure that the people who sign petitions are who they say they are. So this is now the process of how this goes through. Signature verification takes place at the Registrar of Voters for each of California's 58 counties. First, county election officials manually count the number of signatures that have been turned in. Then they take a look at each signature and match it against the signature on a voter registration card. Finally, they go back and check their work. Now, election officials also make sure each voter is only counted once. So as they go through the petition and the signature is validated, they update their computer system to keep track of voters that have signed a petition and then strike any duplicates. So that name comes up again later, it doesn't get counted again. Then after that, the counties report to the Secretary of State how many signatures they've received and how many were invalid. So they have to give the total number and then the number that is invalid. So the net number obviously would be what counts towards the recall. After they finish this step, by April 29th for the Newsom recall, voters have 30 days to remove their signatures from the petitions if they want. So also, again, remember we talked about the 5-county rule. It's not 12% of voters in each of those counties. So you could have, let's say, almost all the signatures from one county, and let's say just you only have to have one signature from each of the other four other counties, and that's enough to qualify as long as that total number is 12%. Because obviously the registrars have to just report it's a statewide number. It's not based on the counties. You don't have to have 12% of all the counties that qualify. You have to have just 12% of the state total. So then you have 30 days to remove their signatures if you want. I doubt many people are going to do that. The Newsom recall campaign has been doing its own verification process before submitting signatures to the county. That's likely help it achieve a high rate of valid signatures, about 84%. So that's pretty good. But that hasn't stopped some conservatives from sowing doubts about California's signature verification process as they try to gin up support for the recall. So basically, they're rehashing the Donald Trump lines. GOP Representative Darrell Issa of Vista told Politico he believes Democrats will lie, cheat, and steal to manipulate the signature count, though he had no evidence of it. So again, here we go with making accusations. And they actually won in this case, and they're still, getting crap for it. Numerous Republican politicians shared a false statement actor Kevin Sorbo posted on Twitter, claiming that California election officials checked signatures on the recall petitions, but not on mail-in ballots. And according to Neil Kelly of the Orange County Registrar of Voters, who's, I don't know if he's a Republican or not, but Orange County's, it's become purple more recently, but it's been historically a conservative haven here in California. He said that the signature verification process for mail-in ballots is the same as it is for petitions. And David Gilliard, who is the veteran GOP consultant working on the recall, said he has confidence in election officials. He said that the system in California has always been very straightforward. I don't think the registrars will play games. And that's probably true. So, all right. So let's look at the first successful recall. And so this was actually the first one to qualify for the ballot in California. We've had this process. It became law in 1911 as a result of progressive era reforms that spread across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So this is the era of, when in the 1900s, it really was first started under William McKinley. Then it was really ramped up under Theodore Roosevelt, and then William Howard Taft kind of became was really kind of the first conservative Republican to serve as president, which actually prompted Teddy Roosevelt to run for a third term as a third party candidate, and he actually finished second. So that was the last time the Republicans actually did not finish in the top two for the presidential election. That's when Woodrow Wilson was elected. And so around the same time in state government, there was a progressive movement as well. The ability to recall officials came along with the initiative and referendum processes, which has been a disaster in California for the most part, just because it has caused lots of chaos and pandemonium within our Constitution. It has made California's Constitution one of the longest in the world. And the movement was in California was spearheaded by Republican Governor Hiram Johnson, a reformist who called the recall process a precautionary measure by which a recalcitrant official can be removed. And that's an old word. I can't even pronounce it. No illegality has to be committed by politicians in order for them to be recalled. If an elected official commits a crime while in office, the state legislature can hold impeachment trials. So you have both impeachment and you've got the recall piece in California. So only the will of the people is necessary to remove an official for a recall. 19 states, as I've mentioned, along with D.C., allow the recall of elected officials. So before the successful recall of Gray Davis, no California statewide official had ever been recalled, though there had been 117 previous attempts. Only 7 of those even made it onto the ballot, all for state legislators. Every governor since Ronald Reagan in 1968 has been subject to a recall effort. So this is only the second time in California history it has been successful for a governor, and it's only the 4th time in U.S. history that it's actually going to go to a ballot. So the first one was in 1921 in North Dakota when Lynn Frazier was recalled over a dispute about state-owned industries and was replaced by Ragnvald A. Nestos. And then the third one after Gray Davis was the second one in 2003. There was a third one in Wisconsin in 2012 when they tried to recall Republican Governor Scott Walker. But that was the first recall to qualify for the ballot, but that failed. So why did we, here in California, recall Gray Davis? Well, first of all, for it to qualify, it was the same 12% was needed. But remember, it was about just shy of 1.5 million signatures were required for Gavin Newsom. For the 2003 recall of Gray Davis, the minimum number of signatures required was only 897,156. So only about 60% of that total. And we'll get into why that is. Partially, it benefited Gavin Newsom that the 2018 election had a very high turnout. So California elects its governors on the presidential midterm elections, okay? So I think that that benefited him in terms of the number of signatures. The bar was a lot higher. In 2002, we'll talk about the election of 2002 in a moment here. So there were 2 major factors, in addition to other things, that really led to to people just being fed up with Gray Davis. The California electricity crisis in the early 2000s, during which many people experienced a tripling in their cost of energy consumption as rolling blackouts happened throughout the state. So we were paying more for energy when we were using it. And that was when we could use it, because there were times where it was shut off because there wasn't enough supply. The other thing that happened was Davis had accepted a $2 million donation, a political donation from the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, the prison guards, as they were called, and used his political connections to pass an estimated $5 billion raise for them over the coming years. So that led to many people throughout California to believe Davis was guilty of corruption, not maybe criminally, but so he couldn't be prosecuted. But it was definitely kind of, the accusation was a pay for play type of situation. I mean, but that's, special interests, are a thing in all politics, especially now with some of the Citizens United case, right? I mean, that was really what has put that on the map. So here is what the petition said about Gray Davis. Governor Davis's actions were a gross mismanagement of California's finances by overspending taxpayers' money, threatening public safety by cutting funds to local governments, failing to account for the exorbitant cost of energy, and failing in general to deal with the state's major problems until they get to the state crisis stage. Now, the entire U.S. economy and its trading partners had been in economic recession at that time. So you recall, in the late 90s, into 2000, you've got the economy's booming. You've got the .com, speculative bubble going. And that was really beneficial to California. So when that ended, even though the country hit a recession, that hit California particularly hard. And then you combine that with the 9/11 attacks, which caused, obviously, a ripple effect throughout the economy. Not as big and not as long, but it definitely had an effect. And so, this .com bubble was from 1996 to 2000. So we were riding a wave right there, right? California state expenditures soared at that point when the government was flush with revenues. And then some Californians blamed Davis and the state legislature for continuing to spend heavily while revenues dried up, ultimately leading to record deficits. Davis was swept into the governor's office in 1998 in a landslide victory and a 60% approval rating as California's economy roared to new heights during the .com boom. Davis took his mandate from the voters and sought out a centrist political position, refusing some demands from labor unions, except for the prison guards, and teachers' organizations on the left. The Democratic Davis, already opposed by Republicans, began losing favor among members of his own party. Nevertheless, Davis's approval ratings remained above 50%. So when California was hit with the electricity crisis in 2001, Davis was blasted for his slow and ineffective response. John and Ken here locally in Los Angeles referred to him, or I think I don't know if it was them or there was another host maybe at a different station that called him Governor Lowbeam. So Jerry Brown was called Governor Moonbeam back in the 70s and 80s. So he got the name Governor Lowbeam. His approval rating dropped into the 30s and never recovered. When the energy crisis settled down, Davis's administration was hit with a fundraising scandal. That's in addition to the prison guards thing. California had a $95 million contract with Oracle Corporation that was found to be unnecessary and overpriced by the state auditor. 3 of Davis's aides were fired and resigned as it was revealed that the governor's technology advisor accepted a $25,000 campaign contribution shortly after the contract was signed. The money was returned, but the scandal fueled close scrutiny of Davis's fundraising for his 2002 re-election bid. In the 2002 primary election, Davis ran unopposed for the Democratic nomination. He spent his campaign funds on attack ads against California Secretary of State Bill Jones and LA Mayor Richard Riordan, the two well-known moderates in the Republican primary. So that was back when we actually had a statewide elected Republican. and even a Republican mayor of the city of Los Angeles, believe it or not. The result was that his opponent in the general election was conservative Republican political newcomer Bill Simon, who was popular within his own party but unknown by a majority of the state population. The attacks from both sides turned off voters and suppressed turnout. Davis ultimately won with 40% of the 7% of the vote, but because of that suppressed turnout, the threshold for the signatures that were required for the recall were actually substantially lower. So remember, I talked about that Gavin Newsom was elected in a almost a record turnout for a midterm election in 2018. So that's why the threshold was so much higher. It wasn't just that the population has grown when it has, but that was just one factor. The other factor was a much higher voter turnout in 2018 versus 2002. So on December 18th, 2002, just over a month after being reelected, Davis announced that California would face a record budget deficit, possibly as high as $35 billion, a forecast $13.7 billion higher than a month earlier. So basically, they just withheld that little piece of information until after the election, of course, right? The number was finally estimated to be $38.2 billion, more than all 49 other states' deficits combined. After already suffering from low approval ratings, Davis's numbers hit historic lows by April 2003, with a 24% approval and 65% disapproval, according to a California field poll. Davis was ultimately universally disliked by both Republicans and Democrats in the state, and a recall push was high. A hot-button issue that seemed to galvanize the public was the vehicle license fee increase Davis implemented under provisions of legislation passed by his predecessor, who was a Republican, by the way, which originally reduced the fee. That was Pete Wilson. That was the previous governor. On June 20th, 2003, the Davis administration reinstituted the full vehicle license fee, and the action withstood legal challenge. The action was a key step in the plan to close the $38 billion shortfall in the 2003-2004 budget. The increase tripled the vehicle license fee for the average car owner and began appearing in renewal notices starting August 1st. The California state budget passed in July 2003 included the projected $4 billion in increased vehicle license fee revenue. So, obviously, all of those things kind of combined to get Davis out of office. Ultimately, the recall won with 55.39% of the vote, people saying yes, and 44.61% saying no. So the recall won by about 970,000 votes. And so that was when Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected, and he was elected with 48.6% of the vote of the people that were running in the recall election. Coming in second was a Democrat, Cruz Bustamante, 31.5%, and coming in a distant third was Republican Tom McClintock at 13.4% of the vote, who probably would have been the best person for the job, honestly. I think that is who I voted for back in that election because I was actually old enough to vote in that election, so I was actually, part of the process. Almost all the state voted to recall him. The only place that voted to keep, the only place that voted not to elect Schwarzenegger in a majority was the Bay Area. So that was what probably kept him under 50%. So that election took place on October 7th, 2003. So it was a random date. And so it was still a Tuesday. So elections are still held on Tuesdays, but it wasn't during that November election cycle. So this qualified in April, much sooner before this election took place. So it could take place maybe even in September. So it's September or October. So we'll see what happens. But why are we recalling Dave Newsom now? So going into the pandemic, Gavin Newsom was actually a very popular governor. And his initial ratings for his handling of the coronavirus was quite high. And the recall petition doesn't even say anything about the pandemic because it was written before the virus even came into being. So that's how long this has been going on. But it gained a surge of signatures after news broke in November that a maskless Newsom, who was very, very pro-mask, joined lobbyists for a dinner party at the posh French Laundry restaurant, even though he was telling Californians to mask up and avoid socializing. So that's when his popularity started to take a turn. He was already starting to take a turn before that, but that really fueled the fire. The count grew as the state's unemployment system paid out billions to fraudsters, and its chaotic COVID vaccine distribution left people scrambling for shots. Even though he continued to brag about how many shots were being given, had nothing to do with him, had to do with the counties. The counties got almost no support from the state. The counties have been doing this on their own. They are the ones that have been doing the heavy lifting, and he's taking credit for it. So who's behind the effort to get him out? Republican activists have been trying to recall Newsom since shortly after he was inaugurated in January 2019. He's probably one of the most liberal governors we've ever had. 5 attempts failed to get enough signatures, but a 6th try led by a retired sheriff's deputy named Orrin Heatley gained momentum after a judge granted supporters extra time to collect signatures due to the stay-at-home order at the start of the pandemic. The one that he did. So he may have inadvertently caused his own recall because of the stay-at-home order and therefore having to extend the time to get signatures. Healy's position cites common conservative criticisms of California: high taxes, rampant homelessness, immigrant-friendly policies, and Newsom's move to halt executions despite voters' past support for the death penalty. A few Silicon Valley tech executives who previously donated to Democrats now support the recall. Voters signed the recall petitions because California is on the wrong track and we deserve better than the failures of this incompetent governor. California GOP chairperson Jessica Malone Patterson said in a statement after the announcement on enough valid signatures. Gavin Newsom earned this recall, and we look forward to helping him into early retirement later this fall. Now, how are Democrats responding to this? For months, Newsom deflected reporters' questions about the recall, saying simply he's focused on his job as governor, working to improve vaccine distribution, reopen schools, and help small businesses. Of course, that means he wasn't taking it seriously. That changed in early March. And then that's when it looked like, oh my gosh, this might actually happen. Newsom used his unusual State of the State speech to lob a high-profile attack on his opponents, and then a few days later launched an official campaign to fight the recall. He promptly made the rounds on national television as California and national Democrats closed ranks to support him. Newsom's strategy in a state that twice resoundingly rejected former President Donald Trump unite Democrats by portraying the recall as a fringy, MAGA-inspired movement full of QAnon conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers. An early attempt to push that message flopped in the aftermath of Trump's loyalist January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. California Democrats held a press conference alleging links between the rioters and recall supporters and calling the recall campaign a, quote, California coup. Journalists immediately pointed out that a coup is an illegal seizure of power, while a recall is a democratic procedure enshrined in the California Constitution. The California Democratic Party leader quickly walked back the coup comparison, but Democrats will continue tying the recall to Trump and the far right, given that the former president is deeply unpopular in California. That may be enough for Newsom to beat back the recall. Is his support eroding? It is, partially because at the beginning of the pandemic, early in the pandemic, he was at 63%. They approved of his job performance back in May. So this is 1 year ago. But what he has to worry about, here's an example of what he has to worry about. What Newsom has to worry about are voters like Jennifer Harris, who lives in Encinitas. It's in San Diego County. She said she registered as a Democrat at age 18 and voted for Newsom in 2018. The same year she ran for school board as an endorsed Democrat. She supported Newsom's actions early in the pandemic, including his first stay-at-home order. But as the pandemic dragged on, she saw little logic in the government's rules to ban playground and outdoor dining. And she grew unbearably frustrated with the closure of her kids' public schools, while many private schools, including the one Newsom's children attended, remained open. The policy has not necessarily been good for the people that the Democratic Party says it's supposed to be representing, which is the working class and the middle class, Harris said. In the fall, she changed her voter registration to nonpartisan and signed the petition to recall Newsom. Now, my wife is not a registered Republican, but she probably is going to be supporting his recall because for those very reasons. Because, again, the liberals have not kept up with the science and they not changed it and it's partly because the red states have commandeered that narrative to try to open up. So what are we going to do? We're going to stay closed because that's Neanderthal thinking. But inadvertently, what they've done now is in order to keep that position, they have to go against the science. They could have probably done something reasonable and still made it look like it was their idea. But now, because the red states have done this, oh no, we can't do that because we're more sophisticated, we know better than them. It might have actually, they're actually making it more political because the science does not agree with them anymore. So who's going to run? We've heard Caitlyn Jenner's going to run. John Cox, who actually ran against him in 2018, is going to run. Kevin Faulconer, the former Republican mayor of San Diego. Doug Ose, a former GOP congressman from Sacramento. Rich Grinnell, a former Trump official from Palm Springs, said he might run. One of the candidates from 2003, Mary Carey, said she's running again. She's a adult film actress. There's two that will not be running that ran in 2003, which is Gary Coleman and Larry Flint, mostly because they're not alive anymore, so they can't run. So it's not clear right now if any Democrats would run to replace Newsom. Anything and everything is on the table. So I'll end with this as far as what the Democrats are going to do, because they're in a sticky situation. One theory is that Newsom would be better positioned to beat back the recall if the options to replace him are too conservative for most California voters. If they want to hold on to the governorship, it would be in the Democrats' best interest not to put up an alternative candidate, said Democratic political consultant Marva Diaz, an editor of Nonpartisan California Target Book. That would allow Democrats to focus on telling voters to vote no on the recall and allow them to steer clear of a confusing message like, vote no on the recall, but if you vote yes, vote for so-and-so. The other theory, it would be political malpractice not to have a Democrat on the ballot on the second question as insurance if Newsom's numbers worsen, said Mike Madrid, a GOP political consultant not involved in the recall. So that will be what is going to be the key, right? But remember, Gray Davis was universally disliked by both Republicans and Democrats back in 2003. He made a number of bonehead moves. And yes, has Gavin Newsom made some missteps that probably made the difference between this recall qualifying for the ballot and not qualifying for the ballot? Absolutely. His continued push for restrictions and not taking his foot off the pedal when it comes to those type of things is probably what got his recall on ballot. Now, remember that the number of valid signatures constituted only probably closer to 14% of the number of people that voted in the last election, right? So that's still a small number. That you still have a 36% gap to get to 50% of if you figure the number that turnout's going to be the same. It probably won't be. It'll probably be less because it'll be a special election. Special elections tend to draw fewer people. So the threshold to recall him won't be as high. In other words, you could get fewer yes votes than he got for votes for governor and still actually succeed in the recall. But because the political landscape has changed dramatically since 2003, the Republicans are almost a non-entity in this state. I mean, it probably is the best shot you've got of getting a Republican in California, especially if the Democrats decide to not run anybody against him. But ultimately, I think that this is going to be a flop. I don't think the recall will succeed because we're far too Democratic of a state. We're way more Democratic than we were in 2003. And even then, the recall only won by about 10 percentage points. And Gray Davis was very, very unpopular, both Republicans and Democrats. I just don't see very many hardcore Democrats or even moderate Democrats voting to recall Governor Newsom, especially if there are no alternatives that are available on the Democratic side. And so that strategy of not running a Democrat probably will pay off. If you did run one, you probably want to run the lieutenant governor. But again, even if that were the case and you just don't like Gavin Newsom personally, that's why I just don't think that, that's why I don't think the Democrats have to run anybody, because this is a Republican movement. There are not too many Democrats that dislike him. There are some, like we talked about that one example, but there's not enough that's going to make a big difference. And ultimately, it might be closer to 50-50 than his 60% vote that he got to be elected. But ultimately, I believe that this is going to fail. I just think the politics of the state are too far left, and there's just not. And honestly, a lot of the Democrats still support the way he's handled the pandemic. So with all those things combined, I just don't think there's enough muster to make a run at this. I just don't see it happening. So I wish it would. I wish it would, especially if they don't run anybody, because I just feel like if you did, otherwise you're just going to end up with a different Democrat, and you might just have a Republican governor that won't be able to do anything for a year because you still have a supermajority in both houses of the legislature. The Assembly has a supermajority. The state Senate has a huge supermajority. And so they're going to override any veto that the governor would give, even if it's a Republican governor. So even if you did something and you did recall him somehow, it's not going to matter, because at the end of the day, he's going to just be he's just going to be overridden. The Republican governor is going to be neutralized anyway by a supermajority of Democrats. So, even if somehow it does succeed, it's not going to matter that much. So my prediction is that Governor Newsom will remain the governor of California, and will most likely, unless something major happens, will most likely be reelected in 2022. So on that sad and depressing note for, I'm sure, a lot of people out there, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show. Thanks for joining us on the Moderate Podcast this week. My website is themoderatepodcast.com. You get us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. All the links are there on the website. Please also take our survey if you have not already done so, and rate us on your favorite podcast catcher, or just rate and review us on Podchaser. That link's right there on the website as well. So until next week, everybody stay safe. Have a great, happy Mother's Day. If you're listening to the show either on or before Mother's Day, if it's after, I hope you gave your mom a big hug and a kiss, and give your mom some love on this Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to my mom. I love you. Happy Mother's Day to my wife. Love you too. You do such a wonderful job with our kids. So until next time, everyone stay safe and keep it real.